Just to start our discussion, the risk profile of Silicon Valley Bank has been frequently described as hidden in plain sight. And the reason for that was that all of their financial risk exposures were clear in their 10K, their call reports, and other filings. And banks of SVB's size are required to have a risk committee. In your experience, Mark, how should the risk committee and the full board have handled this situation?
Well, there's another element that banks have that many other industries don't, and which makes the situation perhaps even more egregious. And that is that banks have regulators. And the regulators repeatedly examine banks and make suggestions about how banks could be improved, how the operations of the bank could be improved. Some of those are called supervisory recommendations, but the more extreme ones are called matters requiring board attention. And those matters must come to the board, must be discussed by the board, and there must be a plan of action for how the bank management is going to deal with those questions. In this case, they had a number of matters requiring board attention that dealt with the issue of the mismatch between their deposits and the investment portfolio that they have. And yet they seem to take no action on it. Now you can fault the regulators for not enforcing those recommendations, and they had tools that they could have used to be more forceful. They didn't do that. But on the other hand, I don't know of a bank director that doesn't pay attention to those requirements because they're at risk with regulators and with their own liability if they ignore them. In this case, clearly what happened, what should have happened, is that the risk committee should have looked at the situation of the large uninsured deposits and the possibility that large uninsured deposits could leave the bank. No one might have predicted that they would have left so quickly. But nonetheless, you have to look at the possibility that they are going to leave over time and what are your alternatives if they do leave. Typically, a bank can go and borrow from the Federal Reserve to fill that hole if necessary. But in this case, the collateral that they had put up for the Federal Reserve wasn't sufficient for them to stem the tide. So should they have brought this matter to the attention of the board? Yes, they should have. Another point that happened was that the chief of risk, the chief risk officer position was left vacant for 8 months and not filled. How could that happen in a situation, and how could the regulators have not been more specific about the need to fill that position? I think if you look at it as a general point and trying to step back, number one, I would say in regulated industries, you should pay attention to what the regulators say. There's a tendency to dismiss what the regulators say. They're just bureaucrats after all. That's a tendency of often people think that. My own personal experience, maybe formed in the 1980s when we had our own crisis in Texas, is that the regulators were more right than we were in looking at the problems that we had. And the fact that they were looking at those problems and bringing them to our attention was one thing that enabled our bank to merge into a larger bank before the crisis became even more difficult to handle and banks failed as other banks in Texas did. So I've always been a believer in paying attention to regulators. Now, what if you do if you're not in a regulated industry? Then you've got a broader problem. And in that, I think it's just a question of asking questions, of always asking questions. And directors should never be afraid to ask questions about what are the risks, what are the things that could happen that would be problematic for our company.